and I am an independent reviewer and an academic as well in my day job. And I'm the author of this particular SAR that we're going to talk about today. We'll spend some time thinking together about this particularly complex Safeguarding Adults review. It involves Matthew, a 55-year-old man who died following repeated non-attendance for life-sustaining dialysis. Hopefully you've all had a copy of the SAR and you've been able to have a quick look at it. But Matthew was an adult with care and support needs who died following this non-attendance for life-sustaining dialysis. Hence, the SAR was commissioned, as in the months before his death, professionals were concerned about his deteriorating health, his physical health, his self-neglect, the worsening home conditions, his increasing social isolation, and the difficulties generally sustaining engagement with essential services. So the review was particularly interested in understanding the interaction between Matthew's mental health needs, his communication differences, his profound dependence on a twin brother, and his apparent refusal or inability to consistently engage with treatment. So the purpose of the SAR, for those of you who aren't familiar with Safeguarding Adult Reviews, is it's not about identifying mistakes or allocating blame. It's about understanding how agencies work together and the systems that are in place to protect people, and how those agencies responded to a man whose risks were escalating despite the continuing professional involvement. So this is really a case that kind of sits at the intersection between self-neglect, non-engagement, autonomy, executive functioning, relational dependency, and the kind of lawful limits of practitioner intervention. So I think perhaps the reason this case might resonate strongly with practitioners is because it raises questions that a lot of us might kind of recognise from everyday practice around what you do when risk is clearly escalating, but you can't sustain engagement, and how we kind of are able to understand choice when somebody appears unable to act on known risk. You know, what happens as well when the access to that person and the reality of their daily life is extremely limited, and how those safeguarding systems respond when the legal framework limits what intervention is possible. So I think it's worth kind of particularly emphasising from the outset that this is definitely not a case where professionals fail to care. It's perhaps one of the strongest features of the review is the persistence and the compassion and concern that was shown by practitioners across services. The renal staff and GPs and safeguarding practitioners, police, and lots of other people made very repeated efforts to engage Matthew, to understand his circumstances and to try and reduce the risks to him. But unfortunately, despite those efforts, professionals found themselves working in a situation that was deeply complex, very emotionally difficult, and often characterised by uncertainty. So today is not about hindsight criticism or identifying any kind of single missed opportunity. It's really about exploring why this case became particularly difficult to navigate, and how those relational dynamics between him and his twin shaped the risk and engagement, and what this might mean for safeguarding practice more broadly. So one of the themes that I'll kind of return to quite a bit throughout today's session is that idea of the autonomous individual, that safeguarding systems are built around that idea, an idea that we can assess people, that we can understand risk and support decision making at the level of an individual person. But Matthew's life and the risks within it were deeply relational, and his world was organised around a very unusually interdependent relationship with his twin. And that shaped how he engaged with services, how decisions were made, how risk was sustained, and also how professionals were kind of able or unable to intervene in his circumstances. So although this is a single SAR that we're talking about, it kind of raises much broader issues around relational autonomy and not having access to people, and that relationally embedded self-neglect that you sometimes get in cases, and around the challenges that practitioners can face when they're confronted with very visible risk, but intervention is constrained. Okay. Sorry, I've inadvertently clicked through a slide without intending. Right. So when we think about systems and safeguarding processes or legal frameworks, it's kind of important to understand who Matthew was as a person and the context in which he was living. So Matthew was a 55-year-old man. He'd lived his entire life in Cumbria, and he had end-stage renal disease, which required regular dialysis in order for him to remain alive, alongside a history of schizoid personality disorder and schizoaffective disorder. And as I've mentioned, he lived with a twin brother in a relationship that was the defining feature of his daily life. And although Matthew could be a very warm, polite, and engaging person with familiar professionals, he often struggled with change, with unfamiliar environments, and any kind of separation from his brother. So over time, his social world had become increasingly restricted, and the brothers lived a very insular life, very much characterized by shared routines, by very limited external relationships, and a strong reliance on one another for that emotional support, structure, and reassurance. And during the review period, concerns really escalated regarding these missed dialysis appointments of Matthew's, his deteriorating physical health, his worsening home conditions, the self-neglect, and his increasing social isolation. And Matthew died, sadly, in February 24, following that non-attendance for dialysis. Okay. So this SAR is really trying to understand not just what happened, but why the system responded as it did, and what barriers practitioners encountered, and what learning could strengthen future responses to adults living in similar circumstances. And before we go into kind of themes and findings, I think it's helpful to understand how the concerns developed over time. So during 2023, renal clinicians became increasingly concerned about Matthew's attendance at dialysis. It wasn't a new thing for him to miss treatment, but practitioners began to observe a pattern of increasing inconsistency and subtle signs that his physical health and his overall well-being were deteriorating. So staff were working really hard to maintain engagement. They were using familiar relationships and adapting their approaches wherever possible, but they were finding it increasingly very difficult to sustain his regular attendance. And alongside these health concerns, there were growing worries about the brothers' living circumstances. Professionals became aware of deteriorating home conditions, of self-neglect and very limited daily living routines, and increasing withdrawal from the outside world. But nobody was able to gain any meaningful access to either Matthew or his home environment, and this was becoming more and more difficult. So a lot of what the agencies understood about the risk in this case had to be very much pieced together from fragmented contacts, from welfare checks and indirect information. And as the concerns escalated, the safeguarding referrals were made by agencies. They attempted to work together to better understand what was happening, but practitioners repeatedly encountered the same challenges, which was essentially that limited access, restricted engagement, an uncertainty about Matthew's ability to act independently of his brother, and a lack of clear pathways for responding to a capacitous adult who was disengaging from life-sustaining treatment. So by late 2023 and early 24, there was a growing sense of urgency amongst professionals. Renal services and primary care, safeguarding practitioners and police, they all recognised that the situation was becoming increasingly serious. But despite significant professional effort, his attendance became even more erratic and concerns about his well-being intensified, and opportunities to assess his circumstances directly remained limited. And in the final weeks of his life, a cluster of missed dialysis sessions prompted repeated attempts to make contact and welfare checks. And practitioners were increasingly worried about what might be happening behind closed doors, but they remained very constrained by that limited access and narrow legal options. Eventually, Matthew was admitted to hospital in a critically unwell condition, and he died shortly afterwards. So looking back, it's not that professionals failed to recognise the risk. In fact, the review found the opposite. The concerns were repeatedly identified and they were discussed and escalated, but the challenge were that these risks were cumulative, that they were relational and often hidden from view, and different agencies were seeing different warning signs, but there was no single point at which that complexity of the situation could easily be brought together and addressed through a coordinated response. And so this is really the starting point for many of the findings that emerged from this SAR. Okay, so one of the strongest themes running through the review was the very hidden nature of Matthew's world. And professionals could see signs that risk was escalating, people were reporting all of these things, but the brother's life was very isolated, and people involved in the case, the practitioners, only had brief or very fragmented opportunities to understand what his daily life even looked like. The access to the home was inconsistent. Matthew was rarely seen on his own independently of his brother, and much of the understanding of the risk kept having to be pieced together over time. So I think it's important to stress this because safeguarding systems generally work best when that risk is visible. We're used to being able to observe and assess and gather information to compare accounts and build a reasonably clear picture of someone's circumstances. And in this case, practitioners were often working with very partial visibility. So particularly the deteriorating home conditions, there were reports of clutter, neglect, that increasing withdrawal from the outside world, but they were rarely able to sustain access to even assess how Matthew was living or how that environment was affecting his well-being. So that uncertainty sits all the way through the case. And this hiddenness wasn't simply the result of professionals failing to try hard enough. When you read the records, you see very repeated attempts at engagement, welfare checks, outreach and safeguarding activity. But the review describes professionals working with that very partial information, and I think that is the reality of this case, that practitioners could sense the deterioration and escalating concerns, but they were trying to understand that risk from the edges of a world that they were unable to see. So this became a formal finding of the review that chronic self-neglect, hazardous home conditions, and deteriorating daily living were recognised by practitioners, but remained insufficiently addressed because the repeated no access limited assessment and intervention. And that risk became increasingly difficult to understand when agencies were unable to gain meaningful access to Matthew or his home environment. So one of the concepts that became increasingly important in understanding this case was the idea of the brothers functioning as what might be described as a closed relational system. So what I mean by this is a relationship that becomes so self-contained and interdependent that it starts to shape not only their emotional life, but also communication, decision-making, engagement with services, and the ability for outside systems to even intervene. So the review identified that the brothers were operating very much as a unit. Their routines, their communication patterns, and their daily functioning was deeply intertwined. And professionals repeatedly described difficulty engaging Matthew independently. There were concerns that separating the brothers for assessment or intervention often led to distress or disengagement. And I think it's really important, again, to stress that this isn't a straightforward situation of coercive control or any kind of obvious domination of one party over the other. In fact, one of the complexities of the case is that the relationship was mutually dependent, seemingly, rather than overtly abusive. And this is important because safeguarding systems are generally much more familiar with recognizing that explicit coercion than they are with understanding relational dependency. And they're also largely built around an individualized model of autonomy. So the idea that we can identify a person's wishes, that we can assess their capacity and understand their decision-making is all at the level of the individual. And some relationships don't operate in neatly individualized ways. So there's quite a bit of literature on relational autonomy. There's some work by Mackenzie and Stolger, and it argues that autonomy is socially situated, that it's shaped through relationships, through dependency and social context. So in other words, people don't make decisions in isolation from the relationships that they live within. And I think this case really illustrates that very powerfully, that Matthew's engagement with treatment, his willingness to leave the home, and even his interaction with professionals was all very closely tied to the presence and involvement of his twin. And professionals increasingly experienced the brothers less as two separate individuals and more as this highly interdependent unit. And so I talked a bit in the review about these ideas around didactic interdependence of twins, which is understanding that some close relationships function as interconnected systems rather than fully separate individuals. And you can see even in the way the brothers communicated, they have their own language, you know, that they responded collectively, and they appeared to sustain shared patterns of withdrawal and disengagement over time. So what made this especially difficult for practitioners was that safeguarding and mental capacity frameworks still required assessment at the level of the individual person. And practitioners were trying to ask, what does Matthew want? Can Matthew make this decision? Is Matthew choosing this? But the reality, it was a lot more relationally complex. And the review repeatedly raises the problem of identifying what we might think of as an independent voice when responses and routines and decision making are deeply intertwined, where it becomes so difficult to separate out where one person's wishes end and another's influence begins, particularly where there's no overt coercion. And so I think, in safeguarding practice, when we work with an implicit assumption that autonomy looks like independence, for some people, it's not experienced that way. It's much more relational. And this doesn't mean that, the legal framework or the application of the legal framework is wrong, or that we move away from individual rights-based practice. But what it does mean is that sometimes we need to have a bit more of a relationally informed understanding of engagement, of dependency, decision-making and risk. And this case kind of exposes the limits of that very individualized safeguarding approach. So finding 2 concluded that Matthew's lifelong dependency on his twin brother had created this highly interdependent relational system that both protected and constrained him. So while the relationship wasn't considered coercive, it reduced opportunities for independent assessment, and it very much complicated practitioners' understanding of Matthew's wishes, his choices, and his ability to engage with support. Okay, so the other really important aspect of the case is the home environment and the way the self-neglect appeared to operate within the brothers' shared life together. And the review identified ongoing concerns about the deteriorating home conditions, the clutter and the poor standards of daily living, that withdrawal from outside support. But what is striking is when you read the practitioners' records, that they were very rarely able to sustain enough access to even assess their environment, or even to fully understand how the brothers were managing to survive day to day. So I think, another aspect of this is that self-neglect here didn't feel entirely individual. And a lot of the safeguarding literature really conceptualizes self-neglect primarily at the level of an individual person. It's something that is linked to kind of personal choice or mental capacity, to cognition or lifestyle, to trauma, or chronic health needs. And of course, all of those things do really matter. But one of the findings in the review is that in some situations, self-neglect can be relationally sustained. So in other words, the conditions of self-neglect aren't always located in one individual, and they can become embedded within the dynamics of the relationship and the shared environment. And, I think you can really see that in this case, that their home functioned as a shared private domain. Resistance to access didn't sit solely with Matthew. It was very much reinforced within the twin relationship itself. And over time, the patterns of withdrawal, avoidance, and disengagement appeared very much mutually sustained as part of that relational containment. It's important because it really challenges, again, the way the safeguarding systems think about self-neglect. Because usually we might ask, why is this individual not engaging? Why is this person living this way? Does that person have capacity? But sometimes we need to ask slightly different questions around how a relationship might be sustaining the risk, and what function does the environment serve within that relationship, and how does the shared world of the home reinforce that withdrawal from outside involvement. So The review also identified that professionals were often trying to understand serious concerns about well-being and daily living through only partial access and fragmented information. And that created a situation where environmental risk was recognised, but very difficult to fully evidence or safely intervene within. And I think this is where that interaction between self-neglect and no access becomes so important. The literature around self-neglect, particularly the Bray, Orr and Preston Schute's work, repeatedly identifies how self-neglect cases are often characterised by that chronicity, by the reduced visibility and the resistance to intervention and perhaps that system drift. But this case just adds to that relational dimension to self-neglect, because the difficulty here is not one person disengaging from services. It's about that interdependent relational system pulling away, the environment itself appearing to reinforce that withdrawal from outside support and sustaining existing routines. So this made the safeguarding challenge qualitatively different in this case. One of the important learning points from the review is that persistent no access, deteriorating home conditions, and relationally embedded self-neglect shouldn't be understood as separate concerns. In cases like this, they might all form part of that same safeguarding dynamic. So this goes to the heart of one of the kind of more difficult questions in the whole review. Was it straightforward refusal, or was something more complicated happening, essentially? So throughout the case, Matthew was missing his dialysis appointments, despite his firm understanding that dialysis was life-sustaining treatment. He could quote that almost verbatim back to professionals. They described increasing concern about the seriousness of the risk, particularly when his attendance was becoming much more inconsistent. And I think, safeguarding systems can become quite binary in the way that we think about situations like this. So either somebody has capacity and they're choosing not to engage, or they lack capacity and intervention becomes possible. But the reality of this case is that it was kind of sitting uncomfortably somewhere in the middle. So Matthew appeared to be able to articulate the risks around missing his dialysis. He could demonstrate understanding at the level of information, but practitioners often observe that there was a significant difficulty translating that understanding into any kind of sustained action. And so that distinction is really important. Increasingly, there's been recognition across health and social care that understanding information isn't always the same thing as being able to organise, initiate and sustain action in everyday life. So those difficulties with executive functioning, with anxiety, dependency and relational dynamics can all affect whether someone is actually able to act on what they understand. So the issue here is not simply, does Matthew understand dialysis? It's about, can Matthew consistently act on that understanding within the context of the life he is living? Profuse apologies, I've just got to let somebody in. I'll be 2 seconds. Okay, sorry, let me carry on. So, because you read the records, you see multiple factors interacting, an anxiety about leaving the home, dependence on routine and familiarity, distress associated with separation from his brother, and withdrawal from outside contact and increasing relational dependency. So this is where safeguarding practice can become quite uncomfortable, because our systems are generally much better at identifying clear incapacity than they are to understanding these relational and functional barriers to autonomous action. And for practitioners, the difficulty wasn't simply whether Matthew understood the risk, but it's why he appeared increasingly unable to act on that understanding consistently. So one of the findings in this review was that Matthew's diagnosed mental health conditions significantly influenced his communication, his engagement, and his decision making. And practitioners repeatedly questioned whether apparent non-engagement reflected a simple refusal of help, or whether mental health, executive functioning difficulties, and relational dependency were affecting his ability to translate that understanding into action. Okay. So we'll just spend a tiny bit more time considering autonomy, because I think this case challenges some of the assumptions that safeguarding systems are built around. So adult safeguarding and mental capacity frameworks are necessarily centred on an individual. The Mental Capacity Act asks us to assess whether this person can understand, retain or use information, weigh information, and whether this person can communicate a decision. And that very individualised framework is extremely important from a rights perspective. But, you know, cases like this just question whether autonomy is always experienced in that fully individual way. And there is this growing body of thinking around relational autonomy, the idea that people's choices and behaviours and decision-making are shaped through their relationships, their dependency and social context, rather than existing in isolation. And Matthew's life was very deeply organised around his relationship with his brother, his engagement with services, attendance at treatment, communication with professionals, and even leaving the home, all were very closely tied to that relationship. So while the safeguarding systems were attempting to assess Matthew as an autonomous individual, it creates a real challenge because legal and safeguarding frameworks require that assessment at the level of an individual person. And the legal framework requires us to make decisions on that basis, except that some relationships become so interdependent that decision-making, routines and behaviour are effectively co-produced within the relationship itself. And, you know, that doesn't always mean that they're coercive. So one of the significant safeguarding learning points from this case is that although there was no clear evidence that Matthew's brother was controlling him overtly or deliberately preventing his engagement with services, the relationship was very mutually dependent and very emotionally significant to both brothers. And this can very powerfully shape people's autonomy. So it can really influence what feels emotionally possible, what feels safe, what routines can be tolerated, and whether engagement with the outside world can be sustained. And I think practitioners often encounter versions of this in practice, even if we don't necessarily have the language for it. We see these situations where one person can't tolerate separation from another, or where engagement collapses if a relationship changes, where people might be unable to act independently despite understanding risk, or where the home environment becomes very organised around shared withdrawal from outside systems. And I think the case can just encourage us to be a bit more curious about those relational dynamics, rather than seeing autonomy purely as an individual cognitive process. So the harder safeguarding question is often, under what relational, emotional and environmental conditions is somebody actually able to exercise autonomy in practice? And I think that question kind of sits at the very heart of this review. So I want to just pause at this point, because I think this is where the case starts moving from being specifically about Matthew into something broader about safeguarding practice. And I suspect that many people in the Teams call will have worked in situations that carry some of these dynamics, that kind of repeated difficulty engaging, the chronic self-neglect, the no access, dependence within relationships, escalating concern but limited intervention options, or a kind of growing professional sense that something's wrong without being able to kind of fully evidence or articulate it. So I think if we just kind of reflect for a moment on when does non-engagement... Hello?
Hey. Oh, hi, Kieran. Hi. I wondered if it was going to be you.
Somebody's not on mute.
Right. Head office have arranged for us to have a smart meter fitted.
Who is
the engineer needs to disconnect the electricity to remove the...
Okay. Where was I? Okay. Lost my screen now. Right. So yes, I wanted to kind of have a joint reflection, really, on when that when that non-engagement stops being a straightforward refusal. When somebody whose life is deeply organised around dependence on another person, it might not mean removing their rights or becoming paternalistic, but trying to have more sophisticated ways of understanding engagement and capacity and dependency and that relational influence. And that's where that kind of professional intuition becomes really important. I just think it would be interesting to hear if anybody's got any reflection on whether these dynamics feel familiar in your own practice, whether you've experienced anything of this kind, and what practitioners find the hardest in cases like this, perhaps, and how people have navigated situations where there is this visible risk, but intervention feels very constrained. Has anybody got any reflections at this point? No, not to worry if you haven't. Right, we'll have some time for questions at the end as well. So, I think, yes, one of the strongest kind of safeguarding learning points in this case is the way that no access gradually became normalised across the system. And throughout the review period, professionals repeatedly struggled to gain access to Matthew or to meaningfully assess his living circumstances. And these welfare checks, the outreach attempts, the safeguarding activity, the repeated efforts to engage him, unfortunately, access remained inconsistent and very limited. And there's a real safeguarding danger when no access becomes seen primarily as a logistical barrier rather than a risk indicator in its own right. Because over time, what can happen is that the systems start adapting to that reduced visibility. The visits are attempted, but they're unsuccessful. Contact becomes fragmented. Understanding can become really partial, and concern can become chronic rather than escalatory. So I think you can really see that process in this case. professionals clearly remained worried. When you read the records, there's a strong sense of escalating unease across multiple services. And because access to Matthew in the home environment remained so limited, they were trying to assess this very serious risk without direct visibility. And that created a situation where risk was increasingly inferred rather than actually observed. There were known concerns about deteriorating home conditions and clutter and self-neglect and withdrawal from the outside world, but professionals were rarely able to sustain access to see how they were living and functioning day to day. And so I think that no access can become particularly dangerous in self-neglect cases. I've seen it in a couple of different reviews now. And the self-neglect literature consistently identifies that these situations are often characterized by that reduced professional visibility, resistance to intervention, and then gradually you get that system drift. So this case kind of adds another layer because that restricted access, as I said, was relationally enforced. The home environment itself was part of the brothers' kind of protected world. And this kind of changes the safeguarding task because practitioners aren't simply trying to gain access to an individual person. They're trying to enter a highly private and interdependent relational system that's becoming increasingly closed to outside involvement. And it's a bit of a different dynamic from straightforward refusal or isolated non-engagement. And I think it raises important questions as well about how you escalate in these situations. So at what point should repeated no access itself become a trigger for a different kind of multi-agency response? As one of the things that this review identified was that risk was recognised across the agencies, but was often held in parallel, so rather than collectively, and that different services were seeing the different fragments of the picture, but there was this limited shared formulation around what that repeated inability to access Matthew might in itself signify. And this is where you find safeguarding systems really start to struggle. We're much more confident at responding to visible crisis than we are responding to progressive invisibility. And actually increasing invisibility might be in itself one of the strongest indicators that risk is escalating. So one of the strongest learning points from the review was that persistent no access should in itself be viewed as a safeguarding indicator, that those repeated unsuccessful attempts to engage Matthew contributed to the risk becoming normalised across the system, and they reduced opportunities for that collective oversight. So I think this is perhaps this aspect is one of the more emotionally difficult aspects of the case for the practitioners involved. Matthew was repeatedly missing the dialysis that was essential to keep him alive. As his attendance became more inconsistent, there was growing recognition across the services that the risks were becoming potentially fatal. And what made this really difficult was that the legal framework significantly constrained what professionals could actually do. So Matthew had been assessed a number of times as having capacity in relation to his decisions about his treatment. And under the Mental Capacity Act, an adult with capacity has the right to refuse medical treatment, even where that refusal may result in serious harm or death. And I think it's important to say clearly, because safeguarding practitioners can sometimes experience these situations as though there must be some legal route to intervene when the risks become mysterious. But in this case, the law did not provide a straightforward mechanism for compulsion. So the Mental Health Act was also limited because dialysis related to a physical health condition it doesn't come under any kind of treatment for mental disorder. So practitioners find themselves operating in a situation where the risk to life is obvious, professionals are increasingly worried, the available legal powers are very narrow or uncertain, And this creates a kind of enormous ethical tension. It doesn't sit comfortably within the categories of safeguarding systems that we're most familiar with. You know, there's no clear incapacity, there's no clear coercive control, there's no clear mental health detention, and no straightforward informed refusal in a traditional sense. So you're trying to work within a much greyer space where Matthew appeared able to articulate the understanding of risk, but his ability to act autonomously was deeply affected by the dependency, the isolation and anxiety and environmental withdrawal and these relational dynamics. So it's really important legally as well as psychologically. The Mental Capacity Act focuses on that functional ability to understand, to retain and weigh information. But cases like this raise those really difficult questions about what using and weighing looks like in practice when decision making is relationally organised and shaped by that dependency. So there was quite a lot of repeated professional uncertainty around thresholds, lawful intervention, what escalation was actually available. And I think that uncertainty contributed to a fragmentation across the system because different agencies were trying to manage different parts of the risk. So you had healthcare trying to sustain dialysis attendance. Safeguarding practitioners were concerned about the self-neglect and living conditions. Police were undertaking welfare checks, and mental health services were being considered in relation to a broader vulnerability. But there's no shared legal safeguarding framework that comfortably held all those issues together. And I think one of the strongest learning points from the review is that safeguarding systems are still not particularly well configured for cases involving capacitous adults who are disengaging from life-sustaining treatment, particularly in contexts like this of relational dependency, self-neglect and restricted access. And practitioners can come really caught between fear of becoming overly paternalistic and then like a fear of not doing enough on the flip side. So the review doesn't suggest that there was a simple legal solution that was available that practitioners failed to use. You know, in many ways, the difficulty was precisely that the legal and ethical landscape itself was deeply uncertain. And I think that is why these cases very much require that early multi-agency discussion, legal consultation, some sort of shared formulation, psychologically informed thinking as well, rather than relying on single service responses or narrow threshold-based responses. Because it's obviously not just a dialysis compliance issue. You know, it's a complex safeguarding situation involving a number of different factors. So the review concluded that the risks associated with missed dialysis were recognised by practitioners, particularly renal clinicians, but the agencies lacked that shared escalation pathway for situations where life-sustaining treatment was repeatedly missed. And risk was therefore often managed within the individual services than through that coordinated multi-agency framework. So we'll just spend a little bit more time talking about some of the legal frameworks. One of the clearest findings in the review that was that practitioners were operating within an extremely narrow legal space. So the case repeatedly raised the question, you know, what can services lawfully do when somebody is at extreme risk but continues to refuse engagement or treatment? And I think it's quite clear that professionals did actively consider the available legal frameworks throughout this period. The primary framework obviously being the Mental Capacity Act. Matthew was repeatedly assessed as having capacity. He was able to articulate, you know, what the dialysis was for, that it was keeping him alive, that mistreatment carried serious risks, including death. And under the Mental Capacity Act, that matters enormously because the Act's very clear that a capacitous adult has the right to refuse treatment, even where that treatment results in serious harm or death. So the legal threshold is not whether professionals agree with the decision or whether the outcome appears irrational, but whether that person can understand, retain, use and weigh and communicate relevant information. And that creates significant difficulty in practice because Matthew was able to understand all the information about his dialysis. And at the same time, practitioners were simultaneously observing that increasing dependency and restricted engagement and that real relational enmeshment with his brother, which became then difficult for him to translate that understanding into sustained action. And so there is this uncertainty around use and weigh element of capacity, particularly in the context of that executive functioning and relational dependency, but still no clear basis legally for overriding a capacitous refusal. So the review also briefly touched on the Mental Health Act and his schizoid personality disorder, his schizoaffective disorder, and practitioners did consider whether the mental health legislation provided any route for intervention, but it can't be used to compel that treatment, as we've already discussed, for physical illness. And there is, it's obviously important because there's an understandable perception that if somebody's seriously mentally unwell and refusing essential treatment, then the Mental Health Act might provide a route in some capacity to reinforce medical care. But in Matthew's case, dialysis related to a physical health condition. So even where the mental disorder is present, the legal thresholds for detention and treatment aren't straightforwardly met. And there was also consideration of the High Court inherent jurisdiction, for example, whether there are any legal routes available through the High Court, where a person's decision-making might be heavily influenced or constrained by another relationship. But, while this twin relationship was highly dependent and enmeshed, there's no evidence of coercion or of controlling influence in a legal sense. So, practitioners are thinking carefully about whether the level of dependency and influence or relational control created the grounds for a different form of intervention. But inherent jurisdiction is generally reserved for situations around coercion, where somebody's ability to exercise free decision-making is critically compromised. There's a situation left here where, the risks are escalating, access is limited, engagement deteriorating, and professionals increasingly worried, but the available legal powers are very, very restrained. The CARE Act also enabled safeguarding inquiry, coordination, and multi-agency discussion, but safeguarding powers don't override the rights of a capacitous adult to refuse intervention or treatment. And I think this is why practitioners consistently during the review describe this feeling of really reaching the limits of what the system could lawfully do. And, importantly, the review doesn't conclude that professionals missed some hidden legal route, that would have necessarily changed the outcome. I think one of the strongest conclusions is the opposite, that this case exposed the limits of existing statutory frameworks in these types of situations. The recommendations as a consequence focus very heavily on that earlier MDT discussion, that shared formulation and legal consultation and mental health input on collective risk ownership rather than simply proposing for stronger intervention. The core challenge here was not an unwillingness to act by practitioners. It's that lawful and ethical space for intervention are exceptionally narrow. So finding 5 in the review recognised that practitioners were operating within significant structural and legal constraints, that staff demonstrated persistence, compassion and professional curiosity, but they were limited by uncertainty around legal powers and difficulties gaining access and the challenges in assessing capacity and context, and the absence of a shared high-risk protocol. So, you know, it's always important, I think, in these reviews that you spend a bit of time recognising the quality of practice. In this case, one of the strongest messages throughout the review is that persistence and compassion, that humanity demonstrated by practitioners in difficult circumstances. It isn't a case where people fail to act, fail to try. You know, when you read the records and you listen to practitioners reflecting in the learning event, there's a very strong sense of people working hard over a prolonged period to maintain engagement, to reduce distress, and to try and keep Matthew safe. And I think, you know, the renal team in particular demonstrated a significant relational skill. You know, they built trust gradually over many years, and they recognised subtle changes in Matthew's presentation. They understood how dependent he was on routine and familiarity, and they really adapted their approaches accordingly. So they would, you know, use familiar staff where they could. They would adapt their communication style, try and reduce his anxiety around attendance. They looked at various transport options, you know, keeping the same taxi driver for him and things like that. So there was also varying contact methods and just repeatedly attempting to re-establish contact every time he missed a dialysis session. So I think that relational continuity was one of the major protective factors in the case, you know, and the GP practice also demonstrated this remarkable continuity in historical knowledge. The family were known to the practice for decades, and so they really understood a lot of these kind of long-standing relational and behavioural patterns that shaped the brothers' lives. And, you know, adult social care, they made repeated safeguarding inquiries, they attempted joint working around self-neglect, they explored all sorts of issues relating to the home environment, to daily living, and the possible influence within the household. And police, you know, doing their welfare checks. So practitioners across the services consistently recognising that escalating concern and trying to engage despite the repeated barriers. And I think, you know, we underestimate the emotional labour involved in this kind of work. You know, that frustration, that uncertainty, that kind of sitting with that moral discomfort and the growing anxiety about someone's deterioration, while simultaneously feeling so constrained by legal options and restricted access. So I think it's, you know, a testimony to them that they continue trying. And, you know, the review highlights some really good examples of professional curiosity and not dismissing somebody as non-compliant, you know, that there was this kind of real recognition that something much more complex was happening, that the twin relationship was shaping the engagement, that the anxiety and dependency around that were very significant, and that the brothers' world was becoming increasingly closed and inaccessible. And, you know, professional curiosity really matters in complex safeguarding cases. The quality of formulation is often more important than simply the number of interventions that are attempted. And, you know, I think importantly, people really reflected honestly afterwards in practitioner learning events. They spoke really openly and really thoughtfully about what had felt difficult, you know, where uncertainty has existed, and the emotional impact of the case on them, you know, where the systems had struggled. So I think that psychologically safe reflection is really essential for meaningful safeguarding learning. You know, the SARs are not about identifying mistakes or coming up with a retrospective fix. You know, it's about looking at and trying to understand how good practitioners can still find themselves constrained by the systems, by the thresholds and the pathways, and you know, the forms of risk that don't fit neatly into frameworks. So yeah, just to finally say that there was a great deal of thoughtful, caring and relational practice operating across the systems that struggled with the complexity of this case. Okay, so this brings me to we've identified a great deal of thoughtful and compassionate practice, but there were several instances where the wider safeguarding system struggled to respond effectively. And one of the key points here is that the difficulties weren't about individual practitioner failings. I don't even really like to use the word failings, but they were about that interaction between the constraints and the systems and the relational complexity and these kind of forms of risk. So I think one of the clearest issues was that risk was held in parallel, as I've kind of mentioned briefly earlier. It wasn't held collectively, and different agencies were seeing different bits of the picture, but there wasn't that kind of joined up working, that practitioners across the services were recognising things, but in isolation. So there was no kind of shared multi-agency formulation of trying to bring the concerns together early enough or strongly enough. And the absence of a clear high-risk pathway for situations that involve persistent non-engagement with life-saving treatments is clear. So I think, this creates a situation where professionals escalate concerns internally within their own systems, but often people are less confident about when that collective escalation should occur, what forum should hold the risk, and what coordinated action is kind of realistically possible. So another systems difficulty was that shared no access and the repeated failed attempts to see Matthew, to assess the home environment, that significantly constrained safeguarding activity, and was a risk that became normalised across time. And so, I've mentioned earlier that importance in recognising that persistent no access shouldn't be understood as an operational frustration. It's a signal, it's a red flag in itself. And that uncertainty around executive functioning, relational dependency and mental capacity, there was repeated recognition that Matthew was able to understand risk intellectually, but he struggled to act independently within the context of his life and his relationship with his brother. And the existing frameworks didn't provide clear ways of conceptualizing or responding to that complexity. So I think another important systems issue here is that agencies are often operating with partial information, because the access is so limited. They're trying to formulate escalating risk without any reliable third-party information, without any visibility or opportunities to conduct assessments of Matthew. And they were relying heavily on relational continuity and intuition and kind of historical knowledge and very subtle changes in his presentation. But one of the strongest findings, I think, is that safeguarding systems aren't particularly well configured for this kind of chronic deterioration and hidden risk, and that relationally embedded self-neglect or interdependent family systems. They work best when there's a kind of immediate crisis, an overt coercion, or a kind of visible abuse, or clearly defined thresholds. So this is much more ambiguous and uncomfortable. It's trying to think carefully about that capacity and coercion and executive functioning is a difficult one. So I think this is why the report kind of ultimately concludes that the system struggled less with recognising risk than with collectively holding and formulating and responding to a type of risk that sits between existing categories and pathways. It's quite an important distinction. It's not that professionals were unaware or on concerns. You know, it's a system that is trying hard to respond to escalating danger whilst lacking the frameworks that comfortably fit the realities of the circumstances. So I think, you know, moving on, one of the most important things about the review is that, you know, there isn't necessarily one thing that would have changed the outcome. You know, the learning's much more about system recognition and collective response to complexity earlier. So, you know, the need for shared formulation, people seeing different aspects of the risk, but those concerns not being drawn together sufficiently into an understanding of what was happening overall. So, you know, it's really important that we create space for these multidisciplinary reflections before situations get to kind of real crisis point. You know, it's not necessarily about what your service should do next, but, you know, what are we collectively understanding about a person's life and the risks that are emerging around them. And also, you know, psychologically informed practice. So, you know, sensing something that more complex is happening. It's not just straightforward refusal or non-compliance. You know, there wasn't necessarily the language for it, but, you know, the need to conceptualize some of these issues of like executive functioning and relational dependency. And this becomes, you know, and it encourages us to be, excuse me, a bit more curious about conditions under which autonomy is exercised in practice. And that understanding risk intellectually isn't the same as being able to act on that understanding. And then we've talked about the non-access and the increasing invisibility being treated as an indicator of escalating risk. And also the value of earlier legal and ethical discussion. So looking at the narrow legal space with experts and trying to navigate difficult questions around the capacity and the autonomy, that kind of vulnerability and opportunity for lawful intervention. And sometimes those early multidisciplinary discussions you know, can help systems tolerate that uncertainty more collectively, rather than leaving individual practitioners to really carry the weight of that uncertainty on their own. So, you know, there's that importance of relational practice. And the strongest protective elements throughout the review was that kind of persistence and continuity shown by frontline practitioners, you know, particularly the kind of renal services. So, you know, we need to be comfortable working with ambiguity. We need to kind of be able to deal with cases that rarely fit into one framework, one diagnosis, or one safeguarding category, you know, and be able to work with risks that are kind of cumulative, relational, and partially hidden. You know, it's not about necessarily finding that perfect legal solution, but having a stronger collective understanding and ownership of risk earlier and having that multi-agency thinking earlier. So the SAR concluded kind of in a nutshell that mental health significantly influenced engagement and decision-making, that relational dependency complicated assessment and safeguarding, that risks associated with the misdialysis were recognised but not collectively owned, that persistent no access limited the understanding of the escalating risk, and finally that structural and legal constraints restricted available intervention options. And, you know, importantly, these recommendations are aimed primarily at the systems rather than any individual practitioners. You know, there was a real strong commitment and persistence across agencies, but it's about strengthening the structures around practitioners, particularly in these self-neglect cases where there's non-engagement and restricted access and life-threatening health deterioration. So I think, you know, just finally rounding off today's session, you know, with reiterating how much effort was put in over many years to support Matthew and to sustain engagement, reduce the risks to him. But that despite their efforts, the system really struggled to safely hold that complexity. And it's important because, you know, safeguarding practice can sometimes create this expectation that if professionals work hard enough and communicate well enough or escalate firmly, that there'll always be a solution. And cases like this kind of remind us that some safeguarding situations sit within very profound legal, ethical and relational uncertainty. You know, so yeah, I think one of the strongest learning point is that, you know, risk doesn't always present loudly or dramatically as well. You know, sometimes it's a bit quieter, it's a bit more hidden, more relational and difficult to assess, and it's just harder for people to respond to and to conceptualize. So I think, you know, hopefully we can use this review to kind of challenge ourselves to think a bit more carefully about autonomy, perhaps, and about you know, that safeguarding systems are often much more comfortable with certain situations, certain fits, you know, but we often get circumstances that sit between these categories, and that we need to try and be a bit more reflective and more psychologically informed and comfortable with these types of complexity. You know, it's not about abandoning autonomy or trying to compel people to do things, but just having a bit more of a multidisciplinary thinking and a relational understanding. You know, that continuing to think together and remain curious and to hold that complexity collectively, particularly where there aren't these standard pathways.